Am I good to start?
Yeah. All right, everyone. Good morning and welcome back to our course. We are in overtime or bonus time, or I don't know what they call it in soccer. What they call it in soccer? Penalty minutes? I don't know. I don't play soccer, but we in bonus time for our course. 7-week course. What history class left out part 2 officially ended last week, but we're going to do 3 extra weeks in March that will be used to talk about specific individuals that lived toward the end of the period that we discussed. So we're going to be talking about personalities from the 19th century, and not folks that are extremely well known. I mean, these people are well known, but we're not going to talk about Harriet Tubman because we do her in our Sheroes class. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Frederick Douglass. We might touch on him a little bit. But the folks that we're really going to engage with over the next 3 weeks, the thing that links them all together is that they were travelers with a wide vision of the African world, and they had expectations for the future right at the time that they're fighting slavery, as well as the beginnings of colonization in Africa. So it's right at this very crucial period in the 19th century or the 1800s that slavery is about to be ended, and these Africans are fighting to end slavery. And they're also seeing the beginnings of colonization and how they react to that. This is a time period where African people around the world are reimagining and rediscovering each other and really starting to function as Africans. You know, prior to this, people are functioning as their own nations, whether they're, Zulu, as we talked about, or they're Mandinka, or they're, in Sudan, they're from the Darfur Kingdom, or they're Oromo, or all these different identities in Swahili city-states. But in the 19th century, because of the experience of the Quilombolas, the Maroons in various places in the Americas, and then the Africans that remained in captivity in the Americas, and then those that got free, that developed this African identity, this amalgamation of different nations and ethnic groups in Africa that were forced together because of the slave trade and enslavement in the Americas. They organize under this identity of African. They start the Free African Society. They start the African Methodist Church. That idea starts to get transplanted back home on the continent because of the people like the ones that we'll talk about, these travelers, as well as the onset of colonization, and that bringing this consciousness of, hey, we're all in this thing together. Let's organize as such. So this is what we're going to talk about for the next 3 weekends. We're going to start our bonus discussion this week talking about 2 individuals. We're going to talk about Dr. Martin R. Delany, as well as Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. Delany and Blyden, 2 descendants of the Nigerian, or what will become Nigeria. One, a descendant of Igbo folks, that's Blyden. One, possibly a descendant of Yoruba folks, that's Delany. Delany, we say possible because as we get into his biography, it's a little unclear. You know, he says that his maternal grandfather, his name was Shango, which we clearly see is a Yoruba name, but he attributes his ancestry to battles between the Mandinka and the Hausa, which was in northern Nigeria. So it's really interesting his lineage, but we'll get into that. So, but in any event, we got two sons of Africa that start their lives in the West, but eventually make their way to Africa and establish a vision for what Blyden called the Africans in exile. So we're going to talk about these two men. We're going to talk about how traveling influenced Delany and Blyden's development. They would not have been the men that they were had they not traveled, had they not experienced the world. We're going to talk about the scholarly achievements of these two men, because they were prolific writers and scholars on the African world, both the ancient African world and the present, because both of these men understood the power of history all the way back in the 19th century. They knew a people devoid of their history could never make a bright future. So they endeavored to do as much research as they could to show the greatness of African civilization in the face of racism, slavery, and then the onset of colonization. Then lastly, we're going to talk about the relevance, or we'll have open discussion toward the end about the relevance of these two men's missions to the African world today. What can we learn from their visions, their way of organizing that influences us today in 2023? So let's get right into it. And as always, we'll have a Q&A in the middle. After I talk about Delany, we'll do a Q&A. Then I'll talk about Blyden, and then we'll close it up. So Martin R. Delany, again, he was descendant. He writes in his memoir, which was actually basically dictated to another person. And I'm going to link a lot of these readings on our course website as well, so you'll be able to read these. But he talks about his lineage. On both sides of his family, his parents were his grandparents came from royalty in Africa, captured as a result of the wars that we talked about in Africa that were instigated so that enslaved labor would come to the Americas. Both of his parents. His parents actually, his grandfather is enslaved. His paternal grandfather is enslaved. He actually escaped slavery in New Orleans, but he gets captured again, makes his way to Canada, actually. But then, not his father actually escaped slavery, makes his way to Canada, but then is re-enslaved in Virginia. His mother was actually free in Virginia. And the part of Virginia he was born in is now West Virginia. Charlestown, West Virginia is where he was born. Because in the American laws regarding slavery, children took the position of the mother. So if you were born to a free woman, you were free. If you were born to an enslaved woman, you were, of course, born into slavery. And that was, of course, because so many African women were raped and sexually violated by the white slave masters. So instead of letting those children be free, taking the position of the father, they took the position of the mother. And it was very rare that this occurred. But Martin Delany was actually born free in 1812, born free in West Virginia. But like all of us in 2023 that are born free, freedom doesn't mean that you live in a just world and that the world will be just to you. In Charleston, West Virginia, it was still Virginia at the time, they found out that Martin Delany's mother had taught Delany and his siblings to read and write. They were literate. Now, even though they were free, it was still illegal to teach Black children to read and write. So they had to leave town. They had to run from Virginia to go to Pennsylvania. At first, the family went to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. There wasn't a lot of opportunities there, so they ended up going to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When he gets to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, he continues his education, and he actually enrolls in a school called the African Education Society. Remember, these free Africans, and this is in the 1800s, this is the 1820s, everything is named African. Everything. The African Educational Society, which was headed by a man named Lewis Woodson, who is really considered the grandfather of Black nationalism, because Woodson lived in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh was incredibly segregated at the time. Another interesting note on the consciousness of these Africans. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at this time, as the Africans are coming there, and this is a growing city at the time in the early 1800s, as the African population grows, they named their community, which is in something that we now call the Hill District in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, they called their community Little Haiti. They called their community Little Haiti. The reason, because so many Africans had such admiration for the Haitian Revolution and Haitian independence. It was the only place that they knew of in the Americas where enslaved people overthrew the system of slavery and set up their own nation. So it became a symbol to black people all over the world. Just like the fake Wakanda is a symbol to black people all over the world. Everybody talk about Wakanda for everybody loves those Black Panther movies. Haiti was the real Wakanda for black people. So they named their community Little Haiti. That's what the community was known as. And this is where Woodson trained Martin Delany. Delany would grow up in Pittsburgh, become incredibly intelligent. He actually started studying with some sympathetic white medical doctors who trained him to become a doctor. He actually enrolled in Harvard's medical school, but he was denied because of his race. So he couldn't finish his complete training at Harvard because they denied him because of his race. But he did finish up his medical training and was a practicing medical doctor. Also in Pittsburgh, he formed a vigilante group called Hannibal's Guards. The reason being, the police would not protect Little Haiti. The Pittsburgh police would not provide protection for the black population in Little Haiti. So Martin Delany took it upon himself. This man was fearless. He took it upon himself to say, if you won't protect us, and it wasn't just, regular crime that the police weren't protecting black people from. During this time, and we're going to see it become even more prevalent after 1850, you had people that were that were human trafficking black folks and bringing free people to the South to re-enslave them. So he formed this vigilante group called Hannibal's Guards to protect the black community in Pittsburgh. He started a newspaper called The Mystery. The Mystery. It was a paper that talked about what was going on in Little Haiti and talked about the need for abolition. This is all in the late 1820s, 1830s that he's writing this paper. He brings Freemasonry to Pittsburgh. He becomes a Mason and sets up and helps establish the Masonic Hall in Pittsburgh, a society of black men, because you had the white Masons, then you had the Prince Hall Masons. These are black Masons that the Grand Lodge started in Boston, and he started one in Pittsburgh. So he was a Mason, he was an organizer of the black community, a defender of the black community in Pittsburgh, and he was a medical doctor. So he treated the black community in so many ways. In the 1840s, he was a member of the Colored Convention movement, where free blacks in Pittsburgh, free blacks in New York, free blacks in Philadelphia, free blacks in Baltimore, and these different places would get together and try to figure out what's going to be the future of the race. Now, they're doing all this in the 1830s, 1840s, when most of the black population in the U.S. is still enslaved. So they realize whatever movements that we create, whatever ideas that we develop, have to be in conjunction with getting our brothers and sisters free. Because these people, their freedom is tenuous. They're either a generation removed from enslavement, or they escaped slavery themselves. People like Frederick Douglass, people like William Steele, and others who were these prominent leaders. So they're either escaped enslaved people, or they are one generation removed from slavery, and they still have relatives that are enslaved down south. So they're trying to figure out, how do we use the freedom that we have to get the freedom of everybody else? How do we maintain our communities that are in hostile territories? Even though we're free, we're still being attacked for trying to educate our children. We are not seen by white doctors. The white police won't take care of us. The communities that we live in don't get the same social services. We're barred from voting in some areas. So they had to figure out what is going to be the destiny of black folks. A lot of the information that I'm talking to you about today, and I always provide you with secondary sources where you can get this information. There's a really good book that came out, I think in 2000, I want to say 6 or 7. But Martin Delany, A Documentary Reader, edited by Robert Levine. This book compiles all of a lot of Delany's major writings. It's a pretty good sized book, and it has his writings, his speeches, his convention records, his articles, all up from this early time all the way up until the end of his life in the 1870s. So very important book if you want to learn about Delany and read what he actually wrote. Everything changes for not just Delany, but the free African communities in the United States in 1850. This is when the Fugitive Slave Act is signed into law. This act basically said, but prior to this, if an enslaved person made their way to the North, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, they would be free. And now if someone from the South came looking for them, those people from those slave catchers would have to go through a lot to try to bring these people back into the South. The South wanted this practice ended. So because of some political compromise and things, the Fugitive Slave Act was signed, which basically said any black person, in any enslaved African that makes their way to the North has the responsibility to return that person back to slavery. The North has the responsibility to assist the slave catchers and the masters that are looking for these people to return these people back to slavery. So the North was no longer free. And it wasn't just enslaved Africans that had escaped that were in danger. Folks were coming from the South and just taking people and making up fake claims that, oh yeah, this guy used to be my slave, he escaped, I want him back in the South, even though that person could have been free their entire life. There was an incredible scandal right near the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland, where slave catchers had come into Pennsylvania, taken a 13-year-old girl and brought her to Maryland, even though this girl had been born free, had never known slavery. And they tried to say, well, she's a slave and we're bringing her back. Luckily, some brothers got together and they went down there and got her and helped free her. But that wasn't an isolated incident. So African people had a decision to make. How do we deal with this Fugitive Slave Act? And you had these large black communities in Philadelphia, which is right near the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. It's not far. It used to be, if you made it to Philadelphia, you were free. But now that wasn't the case. And then same thing with Pittsburgh, same thing with Cleveland, Ohio, and these other places that were right near the border. A lot of people were scared. They were frightened. A lot of folks just went to Canada because they said, well, if the North isn't free anymore, we'll go to Canada. Delany went to Canada, but not yet. He didn't go to Canada because he was scared. He went to Canada for other reasons, because he was willing to fight it out with the slave catchers. That's one of the reasons why he started the Vigilante Group. And he writes this. This is the show, and I'm going to do a lot of these long readings today because I want you to get the full impact of what these men were saying in their writings. So Delany writes in 1850, once the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, he writes to the mayor, he says, Honorable Mayor, and this is the mayor of Pittsburgh, whatever ideas of liberty I may have been received from reading the lives of your revolutionary fathers. And he makes that clear. He's like, listen, I read about George Washington. I read about the people that you hold up as revolutionary. So what I'm telling you comes out of that spirit. He says, I have therein learned that a man has a right to defend his castle with his life, even unto taking of life. Sir, my house is my castle. In that castle are none but my wife and my children, as free as the angels of heaven, and whose liberty is as sacred as the pillars of God. If any man approaches that house in search of a slave, I care not who he may be, whether constable or sheriff, magistrate, or even judge of the Supreme Court. Nay, let it be he who sanctioned this act to become law, which was the president, surrounded by his cabinet and his bodyguard, with the Declaration of Independence waving above his head as his banner and the Constitution of his country upon his breast as his shield. If he crosses the threshold of my door, and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a resting place and righteous heaven my spirit a home. Oh no, he cannot enter that house, and we both live. This is how fearless he was. He's writing this in 1850, where they're killing black people for less. And he's saying, you come to my house, it's me or you. And that's how it's going to be. And he wrote this publicly. This wasn't something, he wrote this to the mayor of Pittsburgh. This is how fearless this man was. But he saw that there was a mass migration of African people to Canada, Canada West, basically Ontario, Chatham, Toronto, these types of places, Kent. So he decides to go there to help the organizing of African people there. But he's never thinking that Canada is the end all be all. His mind is thinking a lot grander. Because as we'll see with Blyden, these men, through their experiences, they learn different things and they evolve. Originally, growing up, and even in his early years studying medicine, he believed that the problems of Black people were primarily because of our condition of slavery. The condition was big in the discourse of Black folks time. This word condition, that we've been put in this condition of slavery and ignorance, and if we can just get out of this condition, then we'll be all right as a people. We need to get education. We need to fix our morality because our morals have been put low because of slavery. That's the condition, the condition, the condition. And Delaney was one of these people that believed that the condition is what makes us what we are and how we're acting. And if we get ourselves straight, then we'll be able to develop. But he realized from his own experience trying to get into Harvard Medical School, from the experience of his colleagues in Pittsburgh and other places in the North, that it wasn't just the condition. It's also institutionalized racism that keeps Black folks down. Once he realized this and he analyzed the destinies of America and his interaction with white folks, he said, you know what? Ultimately, we need to leave. We need to leave America. And even as early as the 1830s, he's thinking about where Black people can go. His first thought is East Africa. He puts in his mind a plan. How do I get Africans to go to East Africa? He didn't want to go to West Africa. He didn't want to deal with the Liberian movement. Delaney, during these early years, despised Liberia because he saw Liberia as a project of the American Colonization Society, which we talked about last week. So he had no interest in going to Liberia and being under the control of white folks. He writes this book in 1854, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States. Very long title. Politically, morally, education, so on and so forth. Very good book. One of the cornerstones of Black nationalism, because he basically argues that Black folks are a nation within a nation. So Delaney writes this book, and in the book, he includes a plan that he had worked out for living in East Africa. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to bring Black people to East Africa. He didn't want them to go to Liberia to be underneath the American Colonization Society. So he said, why would you go to Africa to be under the control of white folks? We should go to East Africa. We could set up trade. We could trade along the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. He kind of had a surface understanding of the Swahili city-states and what was going on in East Africa. Not a lot of direct information, but he knew, hey, this might be a place that we can migrate to. He was also considering Central America, of course, Haiti as well. He said, maybe we can go to Haiti. But he said, nah, still, Central America's too close to the United States. They might try to attack us. We need to go back home. We need to go to Africa, particularly East Africa. This is his first inclination. And he writes about this idea of Black people being a nation. A nation. He's one of the first people to articulate this. And he says this: situated as we are in the United States, many and almost insurmountable obstacles present themselves. We are 4.5 million in number, free and bond. 600,000 of us free, 3.5 million bond or enslaved. We have native hearts and virtues, just as other nations, which in their pristine purity are noble, potent, and a worthy example. We are a nation within a nation, as the Poles in Russia, the Hungarians in Austria, the Welsh, Irish, and Scotch in the British dominions. But we have been by our oppressors despoiled of our purity and corrupted in our native characteristics, so that we have inherited their vices, but few of their virtues, leaving us in character a really broken people. This is what he said. This is that condition talk. So he still maintains some of it, that because of what we've been in, we're a nation distinct, but we lost a lot of our national characteristics because of what has been done to us, our language, our religion, the way we interact with each other. We've adopted all of the bad things of white society, not a lot of the good things, but the bad things because of enslavement. Therefore, we need to get back to building our nation back up with good virtues, things that will help us out. To make this happen, in 1854, So this is 4 years after. So this is the same year that he wrote this. 1854, he and others hold a National Immigration Convention of Colored People in Cleveland. And it's at this convention that he makes the argument that we got to go back to Africa, everybody. We got to go. If we're not safe here, we will never be able to develop as a nation, as a people, if we stay in the Americas. They're forever going to be racist. They're forever going to try to oppress us. If we ever want the chance to really be men and women and stand on our own 2 feet, we have to go back to Africa. And again, this is 1854. This is before colonization really starts off in Africa. And Delany, again, is not thinking like the Liberian, the American Liberians. He doesn't want to go to Africa to dominate. He wants to go to Africa to reincorporate with the masses of the people. He says this. This is his argument for immigration. But we have fully discovered and comprehend the great political disease with which we are affected, the cause of its origin and continuance. And what is now left for us to do is to discover and apply a sovereign remedy, a healing balm to a sorely diseased body, a wrecked but not entirely shattered system. Remember, he's a medical doctor, so he uses a lot of medical analogies in his writing. We propose for this disease a remedy. That remedy is immigration. This immigration should be well advised and, like remedies, applied to remove the disease from the physical system of man, skillfully and carefully applied within the proper time, directed to operate on that part of the system whose greatest tendency shall be to benefit the whole. So he says, we're not going to just run into immigration. We're going to plan. It's like a surgeon just doesn't cut your arm off without any type of plan on what to do next. We're going to plan this thing out so that we can move African people to the continent and then have something set up for them to thrive. And he says, I like this when he talks about Canada. He says, several geographic locales have been named, among which rank the Canadas. These we do not object to as places of temporary relief, especially to the fleeing fugitives, people that have escaped slavery, which, like a palliative, soothes for the time being the misery, but cannot commend them as permanent places upon which to fix our destiny and that of our children who should come after us. But in this connection, we would most earnestly recommend to the colored people of the United States generally to secure by purchase all the lands that they possibly can while selling at the lowest rates under the British people. So he's talking about Canada and government. As time may come, when, like the lands in the United States territories generally, if not as in Oregon and some other territories and states, they may be prevented from entirely from settling or purchasing them, and the preference being given to the white applicant. He's prophetic, because Canada does later on pass a law that says, we don't want any more black people coming to Canada. So he's prophetic in that regard. But he said, Canada's temporary. He says, and here we would not deceive you by disguising the facts that according to political tendency, the Canadas, as well as all British America, at no too very distant day are destined to come into the United States. He says, that was his thinking, that Canada is eventually going to become part of the U.S. A lot of people thought that back then. And were this not the case, so even if Canada doesn't become part of the United States, the odds are against us because the ruling element there, as in the United States, is and ever must be white. The population now standing in all British America, 2.5 million of whites to but 40,000 of the black race, or 61 and a fraction whites to 1 black. The difference being 11 times greater than that of the United States, so that colored people might never hope for anything more than to exist politically by mere sufferance, occupying a secondary position to whites of Canada. The Yankees from this side of the lakes are fast settling in the Canadas, infusing with industrious success all the malignity and Negro hate inseparable from their very being as Christian Democrats and American advocates of equality. So he's saying they're already coming bringing their racism to Canada. So we can't stay here forever because it's going to become just as racist as the United States. Those of us in Canada, you might see the prophecy in what he's saying. You might see the prophecy. So this is 1854. So he said, what do we do? All right, what do we do? What is the remedy? How do we actually make this work? He decides to make a trip back to Nigeria. He wants to go to Nigeria, and he wants to honestly negotiate for land with African rulers on the continent. He doesn't want to be like the American Colonization Society and use trickery and violence to get land. He actually wants to go to Africa, connect with an African ruler. Remember, Africa's not colonized a lot at this time. Most places aren't colonized. He wants to actually find a king, organize a relationship, and then bring people over in an orderly way, in a way that incorporates them to the communities that already exist, as opposed to creating a new colony that, has African Americans separate from the Africans on the continent. He needs to raise money for this trip, for this expedition to Nigeria. So he writes a novel, a serialized novel called Blake, or The Huts of America. And he writes this for two reasons. This is a novel that appears in an African American owned magazine called The Anglo-African. I think it's called The Anglo-African. And it's serialized. So every week, a new chapter of this novel comes out. It's almost like when we watch TV shows, a new episode comes out every week. But people don't have TVs back then. So they're reading these magazines. And this novel comes out every week. So people are looking forward to reading it. We actually don't know the end of this novel because the magazine that it was published in, there are no more copies of the last volume where the ending of this book comes out. But you can still buy the book. Nobody knows how it ends. The second reason he wrote this, so he wrote it to raise money for his trip. The second reason he wrote it is because it came out after Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Uncle Tom's Cabin became a classic American novel dealing with slavery. And Harriet Beecher Stowe writes it, and there's a lot of sympathy for this character of Uncle Tom and all that. Who was a real person by the name. Josiah Henson made his way to Canada, that type of thing. But Delany, like many Africans at the time, didn't like the book. He thought it was an unrealistic representation of Black people. It was written by a white woman. He said, you didn't really get us right. Yeah, it was a good book to show the horrors of slavery and the beatings and breaking up families, but you didn't really get African agency right, what Black people really feel and what we really want to do. Let me fix that, is what Delany said. So he writes this book. This book was one of the most revolutionary books of its time. It's about an enslaved man whose wife is sold away. If you've seen Django, Django's very much like this book. An enslaved man whose wife is sold away from him. He eventually escapes from the master and then goes throughout the South plotting slave rebellions. This is written when slavery was still happening in 1858. He's writing this book. And slavery is a couple years away from being over. So this character in this book is going out throughout the South plotting slave revolts. He eventually goes to Cuba and continues to plot slave revolts. And then he ultimately makes his way to Africa. A very interesting text about revolution, about organizing, and it is very popular during this time among the Black folks that can read. So he makes his money. He gets other people to help finance his trip. And then he eventually joins with this man named Robert Campbell, a Jamaican, born in Kingston, Jamaica, who comes to the United States to work at what was then called the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia, which actually started out as the African Institute in 1837. This was the African Institute, the Institute for Colored Youth. Now it's called Cheyney University of Pennsylvania, is where I happen to work. I've been working there for 10 years. But this is considered the oldest historically Black college in the U.S. Started out as the African Institute. Well, Robert Campbell comes there from Jamaica to teach chemistry. He hears about Delany's trip and he joins the expedition to go to Nigeria. These two Black men, one born in Virginia, one born in Kingston, Jamaica, going back home to Africa to study the land, to figure out what's the best place to settle and to negotiate with an African king to figure out where they could set up shop. And they end up in southwest Nigeria, and they end up in the kingdom of Abeokuta. In Abeokuta, they connect with the king, the Eleke of Abeokuta, which is in Yoruba land, and they negotiate. And it's agreed upon, and they use the assistance of this man, Samuel Ajayi Crowther, the first Black bishop in the Church of England in Africa. He was, again, caught up in this whole slavery business, caught up in the Yoruba civil wars that were happening in Nigeria as a young child. He's captured along with his family. He's sold, and he's about to make his way to the Americas, but the British ship intercept the slave ship of the Portuguese, and he's diverted to Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone, he becomes a missionary, a pastor, but he can still speak the Yoruba language, and he actually makes his way back to Nigeria from Sierra Leone, and there he establishes himself as one of the leading Christian missionaries. He becomes, again, the first black bishop in the Anglican Church, and he works as an interpreter between the Yoruba king in Abeokuta, well, really Egba is a subgroup of the Yoruba, the Egba king in Abeokuta, and Robert Campbell, the Jamaican, Martin Delany, the African American. And they signed this treaty with the king. And this isn't one of those, fake out European treaties that we were talking about before. This is an actual treaty done in brotherhood, where the king agreed to grant and assign to the commissioners, that's Delany and Campbell, on behalf of the African race in America. See how they're calling themselves. They're not calling themselves Negro or colored or anything like that, or black. It's the African race in America, the right and privilege of settling in common, not away from, but right in the community with the Egba people on any part of the territory belonging to Abeokuta, not otherwise occupied. I like this last one. The laws of the Egba people shall be strictly respected by the settlers. So they're not bringing with them American law. They say, we're going to completely submit ourselves to the cultural understandings of what's going on here in all matters in which both parties are concerned. An equal number of commissioners mutually agreed upon shall be appointed. So you see, they signed this. The Eleke, the leader, the king of Abeokuta signed it. A number of the chiefs signed it. Delany and Campbell, it was witnessed by Samuel Carruthers and Samuel Carruthers' son. Very important. And they were going to do this. Delany was going to, and this was signed in 1859. They were going to bring black folks to a new home in Southwest Nigeria to become part of this Yoruba kingdom. That was the plan. 1860, however, the Civil War breaks out in the United States. When the Civil War breaks out, Delany decides that, you know what, let's fight this thing out. Let's fight to end slavery, because maybe when slavery's over, maybe we'll get a fair shot in the United States. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they won't continue to be racist. If we go and we fight, we free our brothers and sisters, then we can figure out what we want to do after that. So Delany goes back to the States. Robert Campbell, though, actually stays in Nigeria. He moves his entire, he's like, you can go back to the United States. I'm from Jamaica originally. So I left Jamaica, I left the United States. I'm not going back. I like it here in Nigeria. He actually stays in Nigeria, raises his family in Lagos, becomes an important writer and advocate for black rights in Lagos, and passes away there. And he's buried there. So Campbell was a really important figure. But Delany goes back to the United States, actually becomes Major Martin Delany. He becomes a major in the Union Army. He actually meets with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln calls him one of the most intelligent men he's ever met. Lincoln, when he goes to Lincoln, he tells Lincoln, he doesn't ask Lincoln anything. Because, I mean, this man has no fear. He doesn't have any deference to white people, no matter if they're the president of the United States or whatever. He went and told Lincoln what was going on. He said, look, we're going to raise an army of black soldiers. And they're going to have black officers. We don't want them to be under white officers. This is what I want. And Lincoln was like, oh, okay, well, we're losing the war, so go ahead. Because at the beginning of the Civil War in the U.S., both Lincoln and the South did not want black people involved. They wanted it to remain a white man's war. Lincoln, only until the North suffered loss after loss after loss, that Lincoln said, you know what, I got to let these Africans fight, because they want to fight, because they want to go in the South to help free their people. So I have to do two things. Number one, I have to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. 1863, Lincoln says, all the enslaved people in the South, you're free, which he really had no authority to do, because the South that seceded was its own country. It was the Confederate States of America. He wasn't the president over them. So in order to make that edict reality, the Union troops had to seize territory in the South and then free those people. So he had to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And again, it's really slick too, because there were some slave-holding places in the border area, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, that stayed loyal to the Union, but they still had slaves. So they got to keep their slaves. It was only the Confederate slaves that were freed under the Emancipation. So Lincoln did that, and then Lincoln had to finally relent to letting black folks fight in the war. And when they did, they fought hard, and they really turned the tide of the victory. And Delaney led troops. He was the highest ranking black person in the military. I wouldn't say he was most successful. I would say that's Harriet Tubman, but she wasn't given an officer's commission. Delaney was actually given a commission, and he was the highest ranking black officer in the U.S. Army. He was Major Delaney. After the Civil War, Delaney would hold some political posts in South Carolina, ran into some controversy over some things, but then the backlash happened. The backlash happened, which is always the case in American race relations. Black people think they're going to get ahead, think that things are going to change, and then there's a backlash. Civil War, the backlash, after a couple of years called Reconstruction, those were the years that he held political office in South Carolina and did things. The whites eventually let the slave masters and their children come back into power in the South. And when they do, we see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, we see the rise of the disenfranchisement of black folks. And Delaney realizes again, this is now the 1870s, that we're never going to get our freedom here. No matter what we do, we shed our blood in the Civil War, we reconstructed the South, we created new state constitutions in the South, and yet they still let the power go back to the racist. We can't be here anymore, it's not safe. So toward the end of his life, again, he started another campaign to bring people back to Africa. This time, though, by the time we get to the 1880s, he's thinking about Liberia, because he sees some changes happening in Liberia, and also Blyden is in Liberia, and we're going to talk about Blyden in a minute. So he decides that, you know what, let's start sending some people back to Liberia. He actually takes a group to Liberia, but he gets sick and he actually passes away in Ohio and dies. But not before he also writes this book, The Origin of Races and Colors, where he talks about the ancient African history. And he talks about the hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt all being a black civilization. He writes this toward the end of his life in 1880. The admission of the hieroglyphic represents to be found on the temples and monuments of Egypt the advanced status of the Negro race, settles at once the controversy and leaves only to be proven the fact that the earliest settlers, builders of the pyramids, sculptors of the sphinxes, and the original god kings were blacks of the Negro race. This is what he writes in 1880. One of the earliest scholars to talk about the blackness of ancient Egypt. So I'm going to stop there with Delaney, but you see how strong and powerful this man was in terms of his thinking, in terms of his foresight, his ability to organize, his ability to articulate, and he is considered the father of the idea of black nationalism. He is going to influence Blyden. We're going to talk about Blyden's travels in a second. Let's do our first Q&A and open it up for any questions or comments. So, Daniel, anything in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat right now, but Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Okay.
Morning, all. It's ironic that you started out this morning with black consciousness. And I will do a little bit of reflection. Today in America, basketball and football is still a master-servant relationship. We support it wholeheartedly. So my question is, how does this black consciousness manifest itself in today's world?
That's a good question. I think it comes in fits and starts. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes this consciousness has to be redeveloped because of tragedy. You know, that's when people decide that they're black again, you know, and it's often follows the backlash sometimes that I talked about in all these race relations. There's always this ray of hope and then the backlash. For instance, Civil War happens, there's hope, there's this period called Reconstruction, then there's the backlash. Then after World War II, black people go fight in World War II. It was those of you that were listening to the lecture on a couple of days ago by Brother Cien. You fight in World War II. Think there's going to be some change, but then there's the backlash. Civil rights movement happens. Some change happens, then there's the backlash. In the American context, Obama gets elected president in 2008. People think, all right, racism is over. That's what people were literally saying that in 2008, that this is it. They've elected a black president. Racism is over, blah, blah, blah. Then we see the backlash. The Tea Party emerges, the rise of Donald Trump. We see more prolific police killings during the time of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown. That happened during the Obama administration. This is the backlash. We're in the middle of a backlash now. 2020, everybody got black. George Floyd gets killed, publicly executed. And people think, well, this has to be the awakening moment. This has to be the moment where people finally say enough is enough. And we see all these organizations and governments. We see Trudeau taking a knee at the rally in Ottawa. We see all these public displays of solidarity and all that. But now you're seeing the backlash. You see all these educational initiatives started in the United States and these diversity, equity, employment things happening, the diversity, inclusion, and equity programs happening. And now there's the backlash. All these states are fighting against it. They're fighting against curriculum that outlines the type of history that we're talking about. And that's slowly going to leak into Canada. That backlash is slowly starting to happen. It's already started with funding starting to dry up for certain things and blackness not becoming a priority anymore. So we see this. So the state of black consciousness now, it was really high, 2 years ago. I think it's still up there among black folks. I think it's starting to wane a little bit. I think we got a little soft when we started getting all this money thrown at us. But I think it's still around. Now, in terms of the athletes themselves, I think they're starting to get it, but they don't have it nearly enough. You look at football. Those black players should tell those owners, listen, we're not going to play another down until you really have a policy to ensure that we can get black head coaches. It's ridiculous. Luckily, I'm from Pittsburgh, so we've had a black head coach for a good time. He's one of the best coaches in the league. But most places in the NFL, there are no black coaches, even though 70% of the players are black. So those players' consciousness is more about, that's sad that's happening, but I need to get my money and to get my paper and all this. Instead of saying, we're not going to play another down until you address this, that we can run for you, we can jump, we can do all these things, but yet you don't feel we're capable enough to lead these men. Yet people with less experience, people with no experience, people coming from being TV announcers to being head coaches with no experience. Yet you got black men like Eric Bieniemy and others that have all this experience that can't get head jobs. So that consciousness needs to continue to be raised. That's key. Thank you for that, Mr. Thomas. Other questions? Any hands?
Agnes, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. So you touched base on what I wanted to talk about, which was the follow through, especially as it relates to our present time. Looking at everything that you described and what's called walking through the life of Martin Delaney, there seems to be a lot of follow through and a lot of things that tangible things that happen. But what I find is that in today's world, there's not very much tangible things happening out of all the causes and all the, I wouldn't call it noise, all the awareness that organizations and individuals are raising. Because I find that after the awareness, then it stops. There's no follow through, and we're not seeing any tangibles. And you're so right when it comes to the education sector of it, because I do quite a lot of work and quite a lot of consulting for the what's called the school boards here in Ottawa. And again, there's no follow through. Yes, this sounds exciting. Yes, this is great. But then we'll use policy and we'll use procedures to tie up the work that actually needs to be done. And then just like a side note, one of the things that is problematic for me that I find that our community, we can actually change and change very easily is how we relate to each other, especially in the media space, you know, and me having like putting on my hat of a Ghanaian, never in our music did I ever hear us referring to each other in like a negative way. We always refer to each other as kings, queens, like with terms of endearment. But then if you bridge it over to the entertainment industry, I don't know when when we start perpetuating such hate towards each other and like really demeaning each other, which then also, of course, I don't need to touch base on the snowball effect that has. And to me, I feel that what's it called? You know the term when you hear and they say that what's called Martin Luther King will be rolling in his grave if he heard this. I find that really relevant in today's age. That at what point has there been such a shift? When I feel that like in all our advocacy work, we're not as efficient and as strategic as back then, like during the 1800 periods. I find that like, and I stand to be corrected, and if I am, please do educate me. But in my opinion, I find that we're not as strategic or as effective because we are also looking at it with many different lenses. And when it comes to how to communicate, I find that our communication skills are really impacted because we're not communicating with the lens or the framework of conflict resolution and how to really be strategic in using conflict resolution in our communication to properly advocate for what we really need and actually follow through to see tangible results. But then again, I could be rumbling, so please do educate me.
No, I think you're right. And one thing I will say though, because you jogged something in me, I don't want it to appear as though back in the 19th century, everybody was on board with this, because you did have these differences. You had these, because Delaney, who was friends with Frederick Douglass, but they disagreed. Frederick Douglass wasn't for immigration in any type of way, whether it was American Colonization Society or what Delaney was trying to do. Frederick Douglass' position was, look, we were born here, we were bred here, we fought for our blood's in the soil of slavery. America is just as much ours as it is white folks. That was his position. He was like, well, I'll never leave America. I'll never, go away from that. Delaney was never for that. In fact, Frederick Douglass writes, and I'm paraphrasing, but Frederick Douglass said about Delaney, Frederick Douglass said, I wake up every morning and I thank God for making me a man. He said, Martin Delaney wakes up every morning and thanks God for making him a black man. So they had this different understanding, and you had differences. But I think between then and now, those folks, even with those differences, were very much into institution building and institution sustaining. I think in our current time, I think one of the problems that we have is we're not as committed to building independent institutions. In a lot of ways, they had to, because that was the only way that they were going to have organizations. There weren't that many interracial organizations that they could be a part of. So they had to, by necessity, form their own organizations, their own schools, their own institutions, and figure out ways to sustain them. I think one of the issues that we have, we live in a more mixed environment and more interracial understandings, which is good, but you shouldn't sacrifice your own institutions completely for that. And I think that's where we're at. And a lot of times, a lot of people that are espousing us having our own institutions, sometimes they're charlatans that just want to take people's money, so then that hurts the ideas. But we got to get back to institution building, honest institution building, the way that they were doing back then, and then having those institutions with vision about what it is that we actually want to do 20, 30, 40 years, because Delaney was thinking about 30 years from now. He wasn't thinking about just his time period. When he was talking about going to these different places, he was talking about setting up nations for posterity, not just for the time being. I don't think a lot of us think like that anymore. So I think that has something to do with it. That's a larger conversation. I'm going to take two more. I'm going to go kind of quick. So Robin and Mr. Francis, if you can make yours quick, then I'll jump back into Blyden, because I know we have to kind of keep it going.
All right, I'll be quick, just comment. So, on what you said, Clyde, the institution building, the further reason for that is that the forces of co-optation are very strong, really effective for like co-opting our people to basically make them less militant, right? So those co-optation forces are really strong. But just to pick up on what Brother Rev said, but bring up sports, your addition to it. So as I've been mentioning in the last few classes, I've been thinking a lot about Jordan Peterson's ideas. Right now, I want to see Jordan Peterson, right? And because I have there's 5,000 people there. A lot of white people think what he thinks. So they're trying to understand what he thinks. So in one of the articles I read recently, he basically said, all those equity groups, I wish they just kind of, just stop yelling about what he calls equity, diversity and inclusion. He calls it diversity, inclusion, and equity, and uses the acronym DIE. Okay? So he always did this, just basically shut up, because he said, most of us just want to be left alone, is what he says, right? Because he's big focus on individual rights. I'm like, most want to be left, that's an interesting statement, right? Because this how it brings back to sports. Guys like Jordan Peterson and all the thousands of people who support him, they don't want to be left alone. They don't want to be left alone, except they still want brown people to serve them at Walmart. They still want brown people to deliver their Amazon packages. They still want brown people to deliver their Uber Eats, and they still want brown people playing in the NFL and the NBA.
That's it. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to make mine rather brief. I am not much of a supporter of sports, with the exception of cricket. And you mentioned about the NFL and the disproportionate representation of black there in the playing field, but not in the management. I couldn't help but think about Cedar Gaskin, who, as general manager of the Toronto Blue Jays, took that young team to the World Championship on 2 consecutive occasions, and was to make it a three-peat except for a strike that took place. And he was never made head coach. Okay. When he was fired, he then came back to work as, I think, a coach for one of the players. I don't remember the position because I don't follow it. In other words, what I'm saying is that we have moved from being entertainment for white people to become entertainers of white people. And until we can make this distinction and see ourselves having values beyond that of being an entertainer, we will always be the way we are. And I would say one further thing, and it may rub some people in the wrong way. How many black women have you seen on national television who look like a black woman without hair down to their waist? And think about the amount of millions and probably billions of dollars that are black women spending to look like white people with hair that doesn't belong to them. And I stop there, sir.
All right. That actually brings up, that's a good foray into Blyden, because those types of ideas were very much a part of Blyden's whole intellectual career. Blyden believed in the power of the black race so much, and the power of the African race. Just like Delaney, this man prided himself on being pure African blood. He prided himself on fighting for his race, and he prided himself on making sure that the race developed on its own terms and not on anyone else's terms, and not trying to imitate or ape anyone else. In terms of a good secondary source on Blyden, a relatively new book within the past 5 years, based off a dissertation written by this professor who's at, I think he's at UC Santa Clara, Harry K. Odom-Matin. He's, I think he's Ghanaian. He's a Ghanaian scholar operating in the U.S., and he writes this intellectual biography of Blyden called Edward Blyden's Intellectual Transformations. Very good text. Anyway, I'll go right into it. Let me, all right. So I'm gonna go through this kind of fast just for the sake of time. Blyden was born in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands. Danish, at the time, controlled by the Danish, Denmark. Really interesting. When we talk about enslavement, and I've been talking about it off and on for the past couple of weeks, Portugal comes up, of course, France, Britain. Those are the big three. The Spanish, of course. We don't talk about the Danish a lot, but the Danish were one of the key enslavers, particularly operating out of Ghana. When we look at Christiansborg Castle, you can still visit in Accra. This was not put up by the Portuguese or the British. This was put up by the Danish. At the time, the Danish-Norway Kingdom. And, as was mentioned by people that have gone there and people that have gone to these slave dungeons in Ghana, they have chapels right on top of dungeons where people would pray while people were being tortured and being prepared to be shipped to the Americas. So his family, he claims he was of Igbo descent. But he may have even had some Ghanaian in him as well because of how the Danish operated. But he says he's of Igbo descent. He was born to free parents in St. Thomas. His parents were actually free, just like Delaney's mother was free. His parents were free in St. Thomas. Eventually, the family moves from St. Thomas to Venezuela. They moved to Venezuela for a little bit, but not a lot of opportunities there. So the family decided to go to the U.S. and for him to continue. Just for the sake of geography, St. Thomas is in these group of islands just to the east of Puerto Rico. So you see they're now the Virgin Islands. It's now the U.S. Virgin Islands because it was given over to the U.S. The Danish gave it up in, I think, 1912, 1917, something like that. But this is where he's from. So eventually the family goes to Venezuela, but then actually they go back to the Virgin Islands. Let me say that. They go back to the Virgin Islands after spending some time in Venezuela. So he's already starting to get that travel experience as a young man. It's in the Virgin Islands that there's some interesting white folks in the Virgin Islands. A lot of Jewish white folks there who had slaves previously but didn't anymore. Jewish families that were well connected with Blyden's family. And he was actually told by one of his mentors, hey, you want this religious education, not in Judaism, this was a Christian mentor, you should go to the United States. So he decides to do so. And when he goes to the United States, he goes to New Jersey, trying to get admitted into one of the theological schools in the U.S., particularly Rutgers University in New Jersey. They deny him. They say, we're not allowing you to come to these schools because you're black, and we're not educating black students in theology. So he's crushed. He's a relatively smart person. He wants to go to school, and they won't let him go to theological school. At the same time, he deals with the same thing that Delaney is dealing with, the Fugitive Slave Act. And just like the black folks that were around Delaney, he's feeling the same anxiety too, because he's hearing these stories of people just kidnapping people and taking them back into slavery. Now, he's coming from the British West Indies. I mean, the Danish West Indies, St. Thomas. You see how he looks. He's dark-skinned. He has an accent. So of anybody, and his family's not there. He doesn't have any, he came there to try to go to school that he can't get into. So if anybody is a target to be re-enslaved and never be heard from again, which is what happened to a lot of people, and sold to New Orleans or Texas or somewhere in the deep South, he would be a prime candidate for that. So he decided, I got to get out of the country. And he was told by some Presbyterian ministers that, hey, there's this group called the American Colonization Society. You may be a perfect candidate to go to Liberia. So unlike Delaney, who refused to go to Liberia, he actually goes to Liberia in 1851. he believes in the American Colonization Society. He's trained as a Presbyterian minister. This is still relatively young. He's 18 years old when he goes to Liberia in 1851. He gets to Liberia, and we already talked about the American Liberians and the American Colonization Society, all of that. He gets to Liberia, he finishes high school, he then goes into the college, the Liberia College, becomes a professor of classics, and about 10 years later, he's a professor in Liberia College. He then becomes the Secretary of State in Liberia in 1864. He holds a number of public political positions in Liberia. He's an ambassador to Britain. He's the first Black ambassador coming from Africa to a European country. And he's there after Liberia has, quote unquote, independence from the US. It's now an independent nation. So he's there and he's working and he's writing. And he writes a number of books. He travels throughout Africa. He actually travels to Egypt. He travels to Palestine, writes a book about it called From West Africa to Palestine. He writes a book about the Negro in ancient history, because as he's learning classics, when someone teaches classics, that means you learn Latin and you learn Greek, which were the measures of intellectual prowess back in the day. If you could speak Latin and Greek, you were considered really smart. So any university graduate in the 19th century, they all spoke Latin and Greek. He's reading this Greek history and this Roman history, and he keeps seeing all this evidence of African people, Ethiopians doing this, Egyptians doing this, that, and the third. And he's like, why are we not talking about this? The Greeks are clearly talking about these powerful African people. The Bible that we've been reading has all these mentions of Ethiopia and Africa all throughout. This is a sense of pride. So he writes this book, The Negro in Ancient History. Just like Delaney, their position is, wait a minute, how can they justify enslavement? How can they justify treating Black people as less than human when we have all these ancient examples of African people in high positions being valorized by Europeans, Greeks, Romans, others? So it became a sense of pride in looking back at the ancient African history and bringing this out, showing that these are what the ancient Europeans said about Africa. This doesn't jive with how you're presenting Africans as savages, as this, that, and the third. So he writes these books. Eventually, he becomes the president of Liberia College in 1881. And throughout this entire time that he's in Liberia, he's also traveling back and forth to the United States. When he becomes Secretary of State of Liberia in 1864, his whole goal is to continue to have African Americans migrate to Liberia. Now, it's a hard sell because this is during the time of the Civil War. So Africans are like, no, we're going to fight it out and see what happens. But he still continues to push this idea of let's make Liberia this great place. Now, at the beginning portion of his career, when he first comes to Liberia, when he's first in these positions, he has a very elitist, well, I wouldn't say elitist because he's not as bad as the true American Liberians, but he does have this belief that it's going to be Christianity and Africans that practice Christianity that's going to uplift the continent. He still had this idea that Africans that were there already in Liberia and throughout the rest of West Africa were somehow in need of civilizing. So he wasn't as bad as the American Liberians. He didn't want to enslave anybody. He didn't want to exploit anybody. But he still, in his early years, had this belief that the Christian civilization, European civilization had these great things to offer, and that it's going to take Black people that have learned these things to bring them back to the continent to teach everybody else. That was his thinking. And he said, I'm going to recruit African Americans, Africans from the Caribbean to come to Liberia so that we can make a great African nation out of Liberia. Liberia could be the experiment. It could be the example of taking the best of Western culture, combining it with African people, and then spreading this light of civilization all over the continent. So he still had that type of thinking at the beginning. He becomes president of Liberia College in 1881, and he writes this about what education is supposed to do. He said, to a certain extent, perhaps to a very important extent, Negroes trained on the soil of Africa have the advantage of those trained in foreign countries. But in all, as a rule, the intellectual and moral results thus far have been far from satisfactory. He's talking about how Black people are educated. There are many men of book learning, but few, very few of any capability, and even few who have that amount or that sort of culture which produces self-respect, confidence in oneself, and efficiency in work. Now, why is this? The evil, it is considered, lies in the system and method of European training to which Negroes everywhere in Christian lands are subjected, and which everywhere affects them unfavorably. Of a different race, different susceptibility, different bent of character from that of the European, they have been trained under influences in many respects adapted only to the Caucasian race. Nearly all the books they read, the very instrument of their culture, have been such as to force them from the groove which is natural to them, where they would be strong and effective without furnishing them with any avenue through which they may move naturally and free from obstruction. What he's saying is European education does more harm than good, currently constructed. And as president of Liberia College, I'm going to create a curriculum that is going to take the technical stuff from European education, but present it to Africans in a way that increases self-confidence. We're not going to have any books that talk about Africa as being a land of savages. We're not going to have any books that talks about Africa as having a dark past that made no contribution to humanity. We're going to have a curriculum that uplifts Black people, and then we're going to take those things that we can use from European civilization to make our country better. He goes on, I'm not going to read all this for the sake of time, but he goes on to say, hence, without the physical and mental aptitude for the enterprises which they are taught to admire and revere, they attempt to copy and imitate them and share the fate of all copyists and imitators. Bound to move on a lower level, they acquire and retain a practical inferiority, transcribing very often the faults rather than the virtue of their models. Besides this result of involuntary impressions, they often receive direct teachings which are not only incapable with, but are destructive to their self-respect. This is key. When we ape Europeans, when we try to be them, when we try to teach our children the same way that they're taught, it always leads to a feeling of inferiority among Black folks if we don't alter the curriculum to make sure that it's meaningful to African people. And this is what he said he was going to do. This is his mentality with education. He fell out of favor in Liberia because the more he learned, the more he actually studied Africa. Once he was done with his training as a Presbyterian minister and he learned the Greek classics and all that, when he turned his gaze to start studying African culture in the hinterlands of Liberia, when he traveled to Sierra Leone, when he traveled to Nigeria, when he traveled throughout West Africa, he began to learn more about Islam first in Africa. Then he learned more about indigenous African religions and cultural practices. That whole idea that he used to have about, oh, we need to come civilize Africa started to change. It started to slowly alter. So he's saying, wait a minute, Africa has a lot to offer. We need to study what's going on before colonization, before slavery, and then figure out how we take the best of both traditions to move forward. But we can't say that we're just bringing all good into Africa and not bringing anything else. And he started to critique the Americo-Liberian ruling class. He said, you have come over here and have basically turned this place into another America, except instead of white people being on top, you that were trained by the whites, you that came from slavery are now doing the same thing. You're treating indigenous Africans the same way the white man treated you. And he critiqued them and they didn't like that. So he ended up actually leaving Liberia for a little bit. He goes to Sierra Leone. He actually hooks up with Samuel Crothers, who we talked about, who was with Delaney. He goes to Sierra Leone, gets involved in education, gets involved in continuing to study the relationship between Islam and Africa, the relationship between African traditional thinking and African people, and how this could be molded and how Africa could be united. That was his goal. And he really attacked the Americo-Liberians. He says, a group of returned exiles, refugees from the house of bondage, settled along a few hundred miles of the coast of their fatherland, attempting to rule millions of people, their own kith and kin, on a foreign system in which they themselves have been imperfectly trained, while knowing very little of the facts of the history of the people they assume to rule, either social, economic, or religious, and taking for granted that the religious and social theories they have been brought across the sea must be adapted to all the needs of the unexpatriated brethren. We are severed from the parent stock, the Aborigines, who are the root, the branch, and the flower of Africa and of any Negro state in Africa. He said, this is by 1909 that he's writing this. He said, the American Liberians are lost. You're not the answer to Africa. It's the actual Africans that were there that are the answer for Africa. Again, he spent the rest of his years in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Nigeria organizing for African Union, creating newspapers and journals that were bringing Africans together. And this is all happening between the 1880s, 90s, early 20th century, when colonization was at its peak. And he's arguing with Africans we got to unite across borders, across West Africa to fight this ongoing colonization. And again, there were times earlier in his career where he was actually for colonization. He was actually for British colonization because he saw the British as being somehow less of a threat than anyone else. So he said, based off the example of Sierra Leone, yeah, let's let the British help bring us together as African people, and then eventually we'll get free and form our own state. That was his long-term thinking. But he was criticized by a lot of Africans at the time who said, why are you supporting British colonization? That's not something that we should do. Later on, he recanted that. He was like, I was wrong. This is the way we should go. We should be forming strong African states without European interference. Blyden would write fundamentally important books, foundational books. And this is why he's considered one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism, this idea of all African people coming together to form a political state, the idea that would influence Marcus Garvey, the idea that would influence Kwame Nkrumah. Blyden had this idea. His big book, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, where he makes arguments for why all of these religions, Christianity and then the Islam that he saw practiced in West Africa, should be the basis of an African civilization. He got into it with a lot of Christian missionaries whom he was supposed to be a representative of, because he didn't see any fault with Islam. He said critiques, but he said, you know, we shouldn't do away with Islam completely. Islam provides structure, it provides literacy. And when we really look at how Christianity has influenced Africa versus how Islam has, at least from his vantage point in West Africa, he said Islam allows Africans to still be African. It provides some structure, but it allows Africans to still be Africans. Christianity, on the other hand, you're bringing in European missionaries. The Europeans control the church. They control all of this. And you make it so that Africans can no longer be Africans anymore. Islam doesn't do that, at least, again, from his vantage point in West Africa. He wasn't really looking at what was going on in East Africa and Northeast Africa. So he writes that. But his big book at the end is his most influential book, African Life and Customs, where he makes this claim that there is such thing as an African personality. And this is, again, an idea that's going to continue after his lifetime. This idea that there's a particular African culture that's different from European culture, that's distinct, and that deserves to be preserved by the people. And that colonization, these other forms of domination, should not be used to snuff out this African personality. And it is off the back of this African personality that he observed throughout multiple cultures in Africa that we can build functional African unity and create a state that will meet the education needs, the economic needs, the political needs of African people. Blyden would pass away. He's buried in Liberia, and he made so many connections. Again, all the way until the end of his life, he was recruiting Africans to come back, because he kept going back and forth between Africa and also traveling in the US in the 1870s and 80s. After that Reconstruction period ended, again, Black people started to question again whether we should be here. So at the same time, Delaney started his African movement again, Blyden started his, and he was recruiting Africans from the United States to come to Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and many of them migrated back to Africa in the 1870s and in the 1880s. He was so popular, there was even a fake Blyden, a guy that was impersonating him, going around the United States recruiting people to go back to Africa. This is how influential he was. When he died and went all over the Negro world, the African world when he passed away. And there were societies in Harlem, New York, and different places called Blyden societies that taught African history the way that he taught, that taught education and the need for African unity the way he taught. So very important figure. A lot more can be said about him. A lot more can be said about Delany, but this was just a brief overview. I'm going to put a lot of the readings up on our course website in the bonus section, so check those out, read those. Next week, we'll talk about a few others. We'll talk about Fannie Jackson Coppin next week. So we'll talk about some sisters next week that also were active during this time period. So we'll stop there today. We'll open it up to any further questions, any announcements, discussion, anything like that.